Hey everyone! Recently I participated in my very first solo game jam, Acerola Jam 0. It was the perfect opportunity to take a step back from my main project and see if I could create a full game based around a theme in just 2 weeks. I wanted to make sure to include all the little details like music, sound effects, menus, and an ending so that it all feels really polished. By publishing a small game, I would finally be able to get a feel for the later parts of a game dev cycle, and I hope to be able to apply these learnings to my main project in the future. So today, let me take you through the full start to finish process of making a Gnormal Journey. It all started with the announcement of the theme, Aberration. The full definition provided was a departure from what is normal, usual, or expected, typically one that is unwelcome. I thought this theme was really interesting, and for some reason the first thing that popped into my head was to make a game about conforming to a society. After a long think, the best idea I could come up with was actually a local multiplayer game. You would control a character trying to blend in with a crowd using the keyboard, while your friend has to guess which character you are by using the mouse. I guess I was kind of inspired by that one Wii game where you have to find the odd person out. But there was just one tiny problem with my idea. After checking the rules, I realised that the games needed to prioritise single-player gameplay, which made a lot of sense actually. But since I liked my idea so much, I decided to stick with it and try to make both single-player and multiplayer modes. As I'm sure you can imagine, this was not really feasible for a 2-week game jam, so I had to scrap multiplayer. But anyway, I didn't realise that at the time, so as soon as I got back home from work, I excitedly set up a new Git repository and created a blank 2D Godot project. I decided the first step would be to create some placeholder art for the characters in Photoshop. Well, at least it was meant to be placeholder art, but I never felt the need to change them, so they stayed. For the overall aesthetic of the game, I was really inspired by a game called the Gnorm Epilogue, which has such charming monochrome pixel art. It's so fun watching these little guys go, and I was hoping to create a similar feeling. It was also around this point where I had the idea to name these creatures Gnorms, which is not only inspired by the Gnorps, but is also obviously a play on the word normal. As you'll come to see, this reflects their societal values. Next, I slapped together a quick character controller script. It's definitely not the prettiest code, but essentially all it's doing is picking one of these 8 directions to go, normalizing that vector, and then multiplying by a speed. So, very basic movement. With Godot's input map system, it was also very easy to hook up the movement to both the arrow keys and WASD keys. I also had to think about the lore of the Gnorms and why the player would be trying to blend in with them in the first place. So I came up with the logical conclusion that the player is actually a monster in disguise, with unknown but questionable intentions. To implement this, I drew up a quick monster shape-shifting animation. I'm not gonna lie, it looked pretty silly, but it was a good placeholder to start with. I was still thinking about multiplayer at this point, so next I did some experimenting with an outline shader. I made it so that when you hover over a Gnorm, the outline shows up, and when you eventually click on the correct one, they turn into a monster. Since I scrapped multiplayer, this functionality was never used in the end, but the outline shader turned out to be quite helpful for something else, which you'll see later on. At this point, it was only around 8:30 PM, so I still had a bit of time to add more things. I decided next I would add the rest of the Gnorms into the scene so I could actually start testing my idea properly. And I really started thinking about how to translate this multiplayer idea I had into single player. With the kind of random crowd movement I had in mind, I wasn't sure how to make the computer detect when the player is actually acting differently from the rest. It was at this point I realised it would be so much easier to have the Gnorms follow a linear path instead. If the player steps off the path, then they would be caught. So then, how do we implement a path? Well, Godot has some nodes for this exact use case. The Path2D node lets you define a path by adding some points. Then, if you add a PathFollow2D node as a child, you can modify the progress or progress ratio fields to automatically move it along the path. There's also a rotate option, which I disabled since I don't want them upside down. Next, all I needed to do was add one line of code to get them moving along the path at runtime. As you can see though, they weren't facing the right direction. So I also added some code to flip the sprite depending on whether it's moving in the positive X direction or negative X direction. Now I had the player movement and Gnorm movement complete, here's what they looked like together. And not that it matters anymore, but I think it's pretty obvious which one I am controlling. Next, I needed a way to detect when the player strays too far out of line. To do this, I simply added an Area 2D node that follows along the path where the player should be. So now, if the player no longer overlaps with this detection circle, they return to being a monster. And at this point it was now midnight, and I was exhausted. But I thought that was pretty good progress for day 1. The next day, my goal was to finish the gameplay loop and prototype a level. First thing I wanted to fix was that it was way too difficult to have to move as soon as the game starts. So I decided to add a countdown. I experimented with pausing all movement during the countdown, but the timing was still difficult when it resumes. Eventually, I made it so that everyone still moves during the countdown like before, but this time the player's controls are disabled. This means you automatically follow along for a bit before the controls are handed to you, which felt much better. Next, I wanted to get started on the background visuals. So using this image as a reference, I drafted up some simple tiles in Photoshop. Then back in Godot, all I had to do was draw in this bit mask to indicate where the tiles should connect. I also thought it would look nice to scatter these detailed tiles randomly around the floor. Instead of placing them manually though, I simply just modified their probability of showing up. So now when I go to fill in an area, it automatically randomizes their appearance. Then I was able to go in by hand and add in some extra tiles to indicate the path. Now that the visuals were starting to come together, I wanted to improve the monster transformation animation. To create some more suspense, I added this shaking effect and updated the sprites for more contrast. The shaking effect was achieved using code, where the position is offset by a random amount each frame. Next, I added in a retry button that appears when you lose, and when clicked, it just reloads the scene. I put in some extra effort here though to have the UI fade in and out. That way the game feels more polished. In order to implement these fades, I decided to try using Tweens. For those who don't know, Tweens in Godot provide a way to smoothly transition from one value to another by using code. I was also very excited to discover that there are many types of transitions to choose from. I ended up using the sine one, which looked like this in the code. This code was then applied to a Polygon 2D node, which I extended to cover the whole screen. Now as you can see, it fades nicely. Moving on, you may have also noticed that at the start of the level, it is visually impossible to distinguish who you are. That was the point for the multiplayer idea I had, but since now that's out the window, I decided to at least add an arrow indicator. In fact, I went ahead and drew a bunch of icons because I also wanted to give the norms some personality. At first I had them run away, but it wasn't really clear why stepping out of line causes you to turn into a monster. So instead, I reworked it slightly so that if you step out of line, the other norms will come and attack you with little swords. Now I guess the monster form is more an act of self-defense. I even updated the monster sprites further, making it look sad and defeated. The only problem is that the norms do bunch up in the same spot, but I ended up just leaving them be like that because it would be kind of complicated to fix. Oh, and since I now had the code for both attacking and fleeing, I left one of the norms to flee as a little Easter egg. The norms also get suspicious of you when you start straying, indicated by these question marks. Thought this was a neat little way to add a bit of personality and also warn the player at the same time. At this point, I felt like I had the fundamentals all figured out, so I spent the rest of the evening planning and prototyping some basic level designs. The levels would start very simple like the straight line, but have the potential to get really complicated, which I was excited about. Day 3 ended up being entirely focused on sound effects and music, which was one of my favourite parts of the jam. Firstly, let me introduce you to this amazing website called SFXR, which can generate really cute 8-bit sounds by tweaking some parameters. Using this website, I made some countdown sounds, a button hover sound effect, a button press sound effect, alert sound effect, and a level complete sound effect. The death sound effect was a little bit more complicated, but essentially I layered a few different staticky sounds together and then added this hit sound that plays on repeat. And with that, the whole morning had already gone, and I was going to move on to something else, but then an interesting melody idea popped into my head. I thought it would fit the norms quite well, so I decided to build upon this idea and see where it goes. But since I obviously don't have the rights to use this Undertale sound, I decided to have a go at creating my own by configuring a synthesizer. Now, I am by no means an expert, but I did want to share what I know about synths anyway, because I think it's super interesting. As you may know, all sounds are made of waves, which can be visualized like this. For computers, some of the simplest waves to generate include sine waves, triangle waves, sawtooth waves, and square waves. So when looking at a synthesizer, you'll often find a section called oscillators that allow you to select the waveform you want. With multiple oscillators, it is easy to layer different waveforms together in order to create unique combinations of sounds. Different synths have different layouts, but the same principles apply. From there, you can shape the sound further by applying an envelope, with parameters called attack, decay, sustain, and release. The envelope can be visualized like this, and watch how the shape affects the final sound. Anyway, I could go on and on, but let me show you how I configured the synth for the game jam because it was super easy. Basically, I searched through the default logic patches for a synth that had nice vibrato. Then I simply switched its oscillators to use a square wave instead. So now this is what it sounds like. And this is what it sounds like in context. If you want to check out the full version, I'll add a link in the description. After importing my music into the game and playtesting, one thing that stuck out to me was when the player gets caught. Instead of writing extra music for the retry menu though, I decided on this hacky fix of adjusting the pitch scale down. So now it sounds like this. After spending the entirety of the previous day on sounds, it was time to get back into some actual feature work. One thing the game definitely needed was a main menu, so I added that first. With this level select button, you are easily able to jump ahead in case you get stuck. Next, I had a go at implementing a pause menu. This had always been a daunting task for me because I assumed it would be really complicated. I spent like an hour coding this absolute mess before realizing I only really need one line of code. Get tree.paused equals true. This pauses everything. However, that includes the pause menu buttons too. To fix this, I learned that all I needed to do was change their process mode property. Pausable mode means the node will only process if the game is not paused. When paused is the opposite. The node will only process when the game is paused. That might sound counterintuitive at first, but it is surprisingly useful. And this is what I used for the pause menu buttons. Another useful one is the always mode, which means the node will always be processed no matter whether the game is paused. This would be applicable to the music, for example. And to finish off the pause menu, I applied a low pass filter which creates a muffled sound. Sometime during the evening, I also went ahead and designed a new character that would coexist with the norms. As you can see, I struggled with the design initially before making it much bigger. I think I just called them big norms in the game, but during the making of this video, I realized that they should have been called enorms. Anyway, their job is to look cute, but actually be kind of a nuisance. In some of the earlier levels, they will just sleep out in the open, so you gotta be careful not to wake them up. This also means that the rest of the norms will move much slower than before. Then in a later level, a bunch of them group up in the center, forcing everyone to take the long way round. I had some more ideas which I'll get to later, but that brings us to the end of day 4. During the next few days, I worked on the game for small amounts during the evenings, mostly spending that time making more levels. I had this incident on level 9 where I kept getting knocked back while playtesting. I checked the Collider debug view and nothing was there. I spent ages going through my code trying to figure out what was wrong and couldn't find anything. tired and confused, I decided to sleep on it and continue looking the next day. And let me tell you, sleep really does wonders, because the next day, I realised that the issue was actually due to this invisible Gnorm lying on the track the whole time. I forgot it was there after copy-pasting a previous level. So yeah, lesson learned, colliders can be active even when invisible. At this point on day 9, I had 9 levels so far. But I didn't want the entire game to just consist of walking along a path, because that would get kind of boring. So here's what I came up with instead. On level 10, the Gnorms harvest some crops. You have to make sure to pick the correct plant, or else the Gnorms will be onto you. I also made sure to consider what happens if you don't pick up a plant. And yeah, the Gnorms don't take kindly to that either. Levels 11 and 12 were themed around traffic, so you sometimes have to give way. It's actually quite challenging to get the timing right, and I definitely made level 12 a bit too difficult. Level 13, however, is probably my favourite. You have to feed the Gnorms like this. Then they spit out a blob of honeydew which you can pick up on your second lap. However, due to this, there are now many ways to fail this level. You could throw the food too early or late, you could not throw the food at all, you could pick up the wrong honeydew, or you could forget to pick up the honeydew completely. Moving on to level 14, I think it speaks for itself. I wanted to make it the hardest level in the game, and I can safely say that has been achieved. The last level, level 15, is a nice relaxing walk into the centre where the Gnorms go to deposit their honeydew. I thought it would make sense for the Gnorms to store their food in a nest, kinda like ants. Most importantly, the nest would also be spelt with a G. Now all that was left was to add some intro and ending cutscenes. I kept the intro cutscene really short and simple with just a basic explanation of the premise. I must say the game turned out quite different to how I was expecting, but I guess it's not necessarily a bad thing. Anyway, thanks to the heavy usage of timers and tweens, this cutscene was really quick to make. The ending scene took me much longer though, probably because I went a bit overboard and painstakingly painted a huge area of tiles to depict the nest. Finally, it was time for some playtesting. The first bit of feedback I got was that it was quite hard to keep track of who you are. So this is where I added a small outline to the player, using that outline shader that I already imported back on day 1. The other feedback was that some of the levels were just too difficult, so I went ahead and doubled the radius of the detection area, which I am very glad I did. At this point, I was quite exhausted with this project, but the finish line was really close. Exporting should be super easy, just gotta add this setting here and... Yep, after all this time, I learnt the hard way that web export is not available for games built with C# in Godot 4. I would still be able to export a Windows build, but I was really devastated because people are far less willing to download games as opposed to play in the browser. All I could do at this point was upload my builds for Windows and Mac and move on, accepting the fact that the game probably wouldn't do very well. After a month passed, the judges played through all 945 games, and it was time for the results to be announced. So how did I go? Well, I made the top 5. I cannot even begin to tell you how amazed I am with this result, especially after I genuinely thought I had no chance. There were so many awesome games submitted, and I would definitely recommend to watch the results stream if you haven't already. So there you go. That concludes the story of how I made a Gnormal Journey, and I hope you enjoyed following the full process. It was a great experience to finally make an entire game from start to finish, and I learnt many things along the way. But anyway, it's time to get back to my other projects now, so see you later.